Hi, welcome to our third presentation. We've looked at the economic context, we've looked at the architect's market, and now we're looking at the changes in our urban form, the changes in cities, and how this may affect the architectural market. This is a lot more speculative than the previous presentations, and how things turn out depend very much on the progress of the virus. So I think it's worth giving a bit of context, the importance of cities. 1 in 5 people now lives in a city with more than 1 million inhabitants, and overall, over half of the world's population live in cities of one size or another. So whilst it's half of the world population, cities, which occupy around 2% of the total land, account for 70% of the global economy, 70% of waste, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 60% of energy consumption. And cities have been increasing. The rate of global urban population has been one of the most marked trends since the war. In 1950, 750 million people lived in cities. Now it's around 4.3 billion, and by 2050 it's likely to be over 6.5 billion. So we're moving from around 55% of the world population living in urban areas to closer to 70% by 2050. And for the UK, London has a premier position, not only in the UK, but globally. There's different ways of measuring cities. London isn't the biggest city in the world, that's Tokyo, but looking at the Global Power City Index, we can see London is ranked number 1 in the world when we look at a range of indicators, not only economy and size, but also environment, R&D, cultural interaction, livability, for example. And we see London's importance when we look at this graph, which gives UK GDP, and we can see that London accounts for 23% of UK GDP. If we add in the southeast, we're up to nearly 2/5 of the UK economy being accounted for by the southeast agglomeration. But COVID-19 is making us start to ask about, do we want to live this way anymore? Do we want to have the daily commute? Do we want to live in offices in serried rows of open plan desks? And I think increasingly, as people work at home, they're starting to ask questions about how we work, shop, move about, and spend time with one another. And the answer to these questions may radically change the buildings we need, the future urban form, and it will also change our economy, what we produce, where we produce it, and what methods of production we use. Of course, another view is that this is a temporary hiatus, and we'll go back to this way of living very quickly once we have a vaccine or effective treatment. But let's have a look at how our lives have changed. This data comes from Google, from just mapping what people do as they carrying their phones that monitor their behaviour around with them. We can see in London there's been a sharp drop, as in most European cities, in time spent in retail and recreation in an urban context. However, there's been a big uptick in people spending time in parks, much less time in workplaces, and much less time moving about in transit stations. Instead, people are spending more time at home. And I think this starts to ask us, are we going to continue this growth of cities we've seen? Now, I think there's a temptation to think that something like the growth of London is predetermined, that it has always been like this, and it will always be like this. But what we've seen from around the mid-80s, from the Big Bang, is a rapid growth of London's population. But prior to that, there was a slow depopulation of London. And we can see here that it went from about 8 million in 1960 to 7.75 million in 1987. So we can't take the growth of cities for granted. Given that, what may we see in the future? Well, I think some negative trends are fairly clear. We're going to see a downward pressure on offices as people move to home working, whether in full or in part, and that reduces the demand for office space. I think we're also likely to see downward pressure on the retail sector. We've already seen the move to online hit some of our city centres. That's been accelerated through the crisis, and we're now seeing a fragility of sectors that serve our office workers, Pret being the example everyone loves. But of course, as things change, buildings and the urban form need to change, so I think there may well be some opportunities, and we're already seeing that among our architects at the RIBA. So that move from the cities to the suburbs, does that mean that there are going to be opportunities for redesigning, reimagining the suburban form, greater provision of shops that were once in the city? Do they now move out of the city? That's certainly a possibility. Are we going to see a growth of secondary cities? Over the last few years, we've seen the north, particularly Manchester and the northwest, go through really rapid growth. Even before the crisis, companies were thinking that the cost of office space, the cost of employment is significantly lower in the regions than it is in London. Are we going to see an acceleration of a shift to the regions? Is there going to be an increase in the amount of domestic work for architects? We're already seeing that come quite strongly through as architects are being engaged in the repurposing of the home environment to make it more suitable to fulfill more functions as a workspace as well as a private space. Will we see the repurposing of cities? So as offices and retail move out, will we start to see greater and more accessible housing? And of course, all this is dependent on the second wave. This may just go and we will return to life as before, where the second wave comes, we're likely to see increased economic downward pressure and perhaps an even stronger rethink of our future. Well, I hope they've been of some interest. Thank you for your time if you've made it this far.